In the dead of a New England winter, two children convulse on a wooden floor. Their bodies seize. Their voices twist into sounds their parents don't recognize. A Bible slips from small hands and thuds against the boards. A family prays. A village listens. And within months, 19 people will be led to the gallows. One man will be crushed under stones, and a community will be forever marked by a single word: Salem. You've heard the term witch hunt. You've seen it used for everything under the sun, but this is the original, not a metaphor, not a meme, a real season of fear in 1692 that spread like frost along a fence post and froze neighbors into enemies. What ignited it? Possession? Poison? Power? Or something even darker? The human need to find a culprit when life stops making sense. Before the first accusation echoed through the meeting house, the pressure had been building for years. Salem Village, a farming community 5 miles inland from Salem town's bustling port, was a tinderbox, pious, proud, and painfully divided. The people here were Puritans, heirs to a harsh theology that saw the world as a battlefield between God and the devil. To them, Satan was not a symbol. He was a strategist. He would creep in through any crack, especially the hearts of the weak, the rebellious, and the unwary. Now, add to that worldview a string of blows that would bend any community. War on the frontier had driven refugees from Maine and the North into Massachusetts, carrying stories of burned cabins and slaughtered families. Smallpox had raked through the colony. Harvests had faltered. Wolves prowled at the edge of the fields, and worse, so did debt, dispute, and rumor. The winter of 1691-92 came down hard and mean. At the center of Salem Village stood the meeting house, and not far off, the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris wasn't a universally beloved minister. His sermons were stern. His contract was contentious. Some villagers wanted him gone. Others defended him fiercely. In a place where church and community were braided together, that kind of split cut deep. Inside the parsonage lived Parris, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, and 2 enslaved people, John Indian and Tituba, whom Parris had brought from Barbados. The girls were children of their time, expected to be silent in worship, to work hard, to keep their eyes down. But they were also imaginative, curious, and like every child in history, drawn to things they probably shouldn't have been. Sometime in the eerie hush of winter, the girls began to play little games, to peek beyond the curtain of the future. Folk fortune-telling wasn't sanctioned by the church, but it was no stranger to kitchens and farmhouses. One popular trick used an egg white dropped into a glass of water, the shapes it made foretelling what was to come. Innocent? Maybe. But in a community primed to see Satan at work, even playful divination could feel like a door cracked open. Then came the fits. At first they were odd spells, staring, babbling, sudden pains. Then they escalated. The girls writhed, shrieked, complained of pinpricks and invisible bites. They said unseen hands were tormenting them. Their bodies folded into impossible postures. They claimed to see specters, ghostly doubles of living people, threatening them from across the room. In Puritan New England, there was a name for this: affliction. Reverend Parris did what any terrified parent would do. He prayed, he fasted, he called neighbors and elders to witness and to help. A local doctor, William Griggs, was summoned. He examined the girls and found no natural cause he could name. His verdict landed with the weight of a hammer on a still hot blade: bewitched. While the household scrambled for a cure, an older neighbor, Mary Sibley, urged a folk counter-charm: bake a witch cake, a foul-sounding thing made from rye meal in a drop of the afflicted girl's urine, and feed it to a dog. The idea, drawn from Old English lore, was that the witch who caused the affliction would cry out in pain when the dog ate the cake, revealing herself. In the Parris household, enslaved Tituba and John Indian prepared the cake. It didn't cure the girls,
It did something else. It gave fuel to suspicion. The devil, people whispered, was near, and someone had let him in. The village strained to make sense of the senseless. Why would God allow children to suffer this way? If Satan was loosed in Salem, who had opened the gate? The afflicted girls described specters pinching and choking them, faces half familiar, rising in their visions like frost on a window pane. A ragged beggar who muttered when asked for alms. A bedridden woman tangled in property disputes. A foreign servant who told stories of an island far away. None
of this was evidence in any modern sense, but this was not a modern courtroom. This was a God-haunted community, convinced that unseen forces could leave real bruises. Meanwhile, beneath the spiritual panic, the old human fractures widened. Families aligned along feuds that were years in the making, fences that ran a little crooked, mortgages that weighed heavy, sermons that cut too sharp. The Putnam family, strong supporters of Reverend Paris, eyed the merchant elite and their allies with distrust. The Porters, wealthier and better connected to Salem town, distrusted the Putnams' hold over village politics. Land, money, office, none of it was immune from the chill of suspicion. The devil was the headline. The fine print was very human. And yet, as the girls gasped and named invisible assailants, another truth hovered in the room. Naming a witch could make the pain stop, or at least make it meaningful. In a world where almost everything was out of ordinary people's control, harvests, disease, war, even their own salvation, there was dangerous relief in finally pointing to a person and saying, "There, that is why we suffer." Within days, whispers curled into accusations. A constable's knock would sound on doors before dawn. The meeting house benches would groan under the weight of neighbors who knew each other's middle names and family trees, and now wondered what else those familiar faces might be hiding. As the affliction spread beyond the parsonage, the village held its breath. Would this pass like a hard winter wind? Or would it break the community, one name at a time? The first formal accusations were coming. The magistrates were about to step in, and when they did, the ground would shift under everyone's feet. The cold February air of 1692 was still heavy with uncertainty when three names broke from the lips of the afflicted girls: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Each name carried weight, and none of it good. Sarah Good was the easiest target. A destitute beggar, she was known for wandering the village, muttering under her breath when refused food or shelter. To Puritan ears, those mutterings were not just bitterness, they might be curses. In a society that prized obedience and godliness, Sarah Good was an outcast, her ragged appearance a ready-made mask for evil. Sarah Osborne was another woman on the margins, though for different reasons. Once married into land and status, she scandalized her neighbors by taking a second husband, a man who had worked as her servant, and by fighting to keep her late husband's property from his sons. In a world where women were expected to submit, Osborne's independence looked suspicious, even dangerous. Illness had kept her from church for years, a fact the Puritans saw less as misfortune and more as a symptom of moral decay. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Paris household. Her skin was dark, her origins foreign, her customs unfamiliar. To the Puritans of Salem Village, she embodied the other, and in times of fear, the other is the easiest vessel for blame. Whispers about her storytelling, her knowledge of island folk magic, and her participation in the witch cake ritual made her a perfect scapegoat. On February 29th, arrest warrants were issued. Constables swept the women into custody. The village, tense and trembling, gathered to hear the examinations. Inside the meeting house, the air was charged. The afflicted girls twisted and screamed as though invisible hands clawed at them. The magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne, pressed the accused to explain these torments. Sarah Good denied everything, but her defiance only confirmed suspicions. "Why do you harm these children?" the magistrates demanded. Her refusal to confess marked her as stubborn, which, to the Puritan mind, was near enough to guilty. Sarah Osborne, frail and sick, struggled to defend herself. Her absence from church, her disputes over land, each became ammunition. To her accusers, her isolation from godly society made her ripe for Satan's grip. But it was Tituba who turned the tide. Pressed, threatened, and likely fearing for her life, she confessed. Yes, she said, she had seen the devil. Yes, there were witches in Salem, but it was not just her. Others were in league with him too. She spoke of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a tall man in dark clothing who commanded her. She claimed witches flew on sticks, signed the devil's book, and plotted to destroy the Puritans. Her words detonated like powder. This was more than accusation, it was confirmation. The devil was not only real, but organized, and he had helpers in Salem Village. Suddenly, the crisis wasn't about 3 women, it was about a conspiracy. If Tituba was telling the truth, then anyone could be a witch, a neighbor, a friend, even kin. The afflicted girls writhed on the floor as if Tituba's confession gave their torments new life. Magistrates and ministers leaned in. Villagers exchanged wary glances. If one enslaved servant could see the devil, how many more unseen allies lurked among them?
In the weeks that followed, the number of afflicted children grew. So did the accusations. Women and men, young and old, began to fall under suspicion. Prominent villagers, once thought untouchable, found their names tangled in whispers. No fence line, no family name, no reputation was safe. The machinery of hysteria had begun to turn. But the Salem Witch Trials were not only about supernatural fears, they were also about earthly grudges. Old disputes over land, inheritance, and status began to surface, cloaked in the Danzak language of witchcraft. Calling your enemy a witch was more than an insult. It was a weapon backed by the law and the church. By the spring of 1692, the Salem jail cells of Salem were swelling with the accused. Iron bars clanged shut behind farmers, midwives, widows, and even children. Shackled and starving, they awaited trials that promised little hope of justice. And in the heart of Salem village, the fever only grew stronger. Because soon the accusations would leap beyond the poor and the powerless. Soon the panic would reach into the homes of the respected, the wealthy, and even the devout. That's when the hysteria would ignite into full-blown fire. By the spring of 1692, Salem was no longer just a village in fear. It was a village in flames. Though the fire was not of wood and pitch, but of rumor, suspicion, and panic. The accusations spread like sparks, leaping from rooftop to rooftop. At first, it had been the marginal, the unwanted, the easy targets. But now the net widened. Prominent names began to fall. Respectable farmers, respected wives, women who had knelt in the pews every Sabbath, none were immune. One of the most shocking arrests came in April. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, grandmother, pious church member, widely admired for her devotion. She was everything the Puritans considered godly. But in Salem's fevered air, even her gentleness was twisted into menace. The afflicted girls cried out at her presence, shrieking that her spirit stabbed them with needles and choked their throats. Despite petitions signed by dozens of her neighbors affirming her character, the magistrates pressed forward. If someone as devout as Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then no one was beyond suspicion. Another name cut even deeper, Martha Corey, a woman of strong faith, married to Giles Corey, a landowner with property and standing. Martha had openly criticized the trials, calling the accusations absurd.
for her skepticism, she herself was accused. In Salem, doubt became evidence of guilt. Her husband, Giles Corey, would later meet one of the most infamous fates of the entire tragedy. By the early summer, Salem's jails overflowed. Chains rattled in darkened cells where the accused waited on damp straw for hearings that grew more hostile by the day. Over 100 people had been accused, and the tide showed no sign of ebbing. The role of spectral evidence. Central to the trials was something deeply dangerous: spectral evidence. In Salem's courts, a person's spirit, or specter, could be said to leave their body and torment others. If the afflicted claimed to see your spirit in a dream or vision, the magistrates considered it proof enough that you were allied with the devil. Imagine that. Your neighbor says they saw you in their dreams, choking you, clawing at you, or signing the devil's book, and suddenly you're shackled, dragged to court, and forced to answer for crimes committed in someone else's visions. The court allowed this evidence, and with it, the imagination of the afflicted became as sharp as any blade. The court of Oyer and Terminer. Governor William Phips, newly arrived in Massachusetts, faced a colony in chaos. To handle the swelling tide of cases, he established a special court in May 1692, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. The leading voice in this court was Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man as stern in faith as he was zealous in judgment. With him sat magistrates, ready to see Satan's hand behind every strange affliction. In their eyes, the colony was at war with the devil, and leniency was betrayal. The trials were not quiet affairs. The meeting house groaned with spectators. Gasps and cries punctuated the examinations. The afflicted collapsed, shrieked or writhed as the accused entered the room, their bodies performing the very evidence that would condemn neighbors to death. One of the first to face the court was Bridget Bishop, a woman long whispered about for her unconventional ways. She wore bright clothing, enjoyed taverns, and had been accused of witchcraft before, though acquitted. This time, she would not escape. Witnesses testified to her spirit tormenting them. The afflicted shrieked at her presence. Tools found in her home were twisted into signs of sorcery. Against such a storm, Bridget's protests of innocence were barely heard. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was led to the gallows at Proctor's Ledge. The rope tightened around her neck. With her death, Salem crossed a line it could never uncross. The witch hunt had claimed its first life, and it would not stop there, because with Bridget's execution, the court had confirmed what the village already feared. The devil was real, and he was at work in Salem. The trials would accelerate. The gallows would not stand empty for long. As summer deepened, the list of the condemned would grow, including mothers, farmers, ministers, and more. Salem's hysteria was no longer a whisper in the cold. It was a roar that could be heard across Massachusetts. And soon, it would devour some of the colony's most respected names, turning husbands against wives, children against parents, and the law itself into an instrument of fear. With Bridget Bishop's hanging in June, Salem had crossed a line of no return. The gallows had spoken, and in the minds of many, justice had been served. But instead of quelling fear, her execution poured fuel on the fire. If one witch had been found, surely more were hiding. Through June and July, the court convened again and again, its benches packed with anxious spectators. Each session brought new accusations, new screams from the afflicted, new faces dragged in shackles before the magistrates, and always more names spilled forth. The accusations multiply. One of the most shocking names was that of Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, Frail, devout, she was the very image of Puritan virtue. Neighbors signed petitions declaring her innocence, yet the afflicted collapsed at her presence, writhing and shrieking as though she stabbed them with invisible pins. In Salem's fevered air, her piety itself became suspicious, proof that the devil was cunning enough to disguise his servants as saints. Another was Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey, a respected landowner. Martha had mocked the trials, dismissing the girl's fits as nonsense. That skepticism sealed her fate. To question the afflicted was to side with the devil. She was arrested and chained, her protests ignored. By midsummer, accusations reached beyond Salem village into surrounding towns. Fear seeped outward like ink bleeding across parchment. Gloucester, Andover, Ipswich. Suddenly, the specter of witchcraft was everywhere. The court of Oyer and Terminer, the special court Governor Phipps had established, the court of Oyer and Terminer, was now the colony's most powerful stage. Presiding was Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man convinced of the devil's plot, and the court allowed the most dangerous kind of evidence, spectral evidence. If the afflicted claimed to see your spirit tormenting them, even if you were standing in plain sight, doing nothing, the court accepted it. Invisible visions, unprovable dreams, ghostly doubles. This became the rope that tied neighbors' necks. It was a nightmare no one could wake from, for how could you defend yourself against the dreams of another? The execution of Rebecca Nurse. On July 19th, the gallows claimed 5 more victims. Among them was Rebecca Nurse. Despite petitions and pleas, despite her unwavering devotion, the court condemned her. As she was led to Proctor's Ledge, many in the crowd whispered prayers, torn between horror and fear, but none dared to speak too loudly. To doubt the court was to risk joining her at the noose. The madness peaked. The panic no longer spared even the powerful. By August, accusations touched the highest levels: ministers, merchants, even the wife of the colony's own governor. Fear was no longer a shadow, it was daylight, marching openly through the streets of Massachusetts. And then came one of the most shocking moments of all: the arrest of Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. When a man of God could be accused of witchcraft, no one was safe. The stage was set for the bloodiest months of the trials. Salem's hysteria had reached its boiling point, and the executions were only beginning. By August of 1692, the executions had become relentless. The noose swung often, and each time it did, Salem's hysteria deepened. Reverend George Burroughs. Perhaps the most shocking of all was the trial of Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. To many, he was still remembered as a man of Scripture, but to the afflicted, he became the devil's general. Witnesses claimed he possessed superhuman strength, that he had lifted barrels no ordinary man could budge, and that he led covens in dark rites. On August 19th, Burroughs was marched to the gallows, along with 4 others. Before his execution, he stunned the crowd. Standing on the scaffold, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, word for word. It was widely believed that no witch could do such a thing. For a moment, the crowd hesitated. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Was this man truly guilty? Could the court have erred?
But Chief Justice Stockton and the ministers were unmoved. They declared the devil was cunning enough to mimic holiness. The signal was given. The trapdoor opened. Burroughs' body swung. Whatever doubts the people felt were buried under the weight of fear. Giles Corey's defiance. Not all accused submitted to the court's twisted rules. One man stood in stark defiance: Giles Corey, husband of Martha Corey. Charged with witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea.
Without a plea, he could not be tried. Perhaps he hoped to save his estate for his heirs. Perhaps he simply could not stomach giving the court legitimacy. The judges responded with an ancient punishment, peine forte et dure, pressing under heavy stones. Corey was laid in a field, boards placed across his chest, and stones heaped upon him. Witnesses recalled him groaning under the weight, but when urged to confess, his words were not surrender, but a demand, more weight. For 2 days he endured. On September 19, 1692, Giles Corey was crushed to death. He became the only person in American history to suffer this fate. His death sent a shiver through Massachusetts. Was this truly justice, or cruelty masked as piety? The September hangings. Just days later, on September 22nd, 8 more were executed at the gallows. Among them was Martha Corey, Giles's wife. The air was thick with smoke from autumn hearths, but to the people of Salem, it smelled of judgment. The colony was drowning in blood, and still the accusations spread. Salem's breaking point. By autumn, 20 people had been executed. More than 100 languished in fetid jails, shackled and starving, awaiting trial. Some of the colony's most respected citizens had been branded as witches. Even children were not spared. But cracks were forming. Prominent ministers began questioning the reliance on spectral evidence. Neighbors whispered that too many innocents had died. And when accusations touched the wife of Governor Phipps himself, the hysteria had finally reached too high. The tide was about to turn. By late September of 1692, the hysteria that had consumed Salem began to crack under its own weight. The court had hanged the poor, the powerless, and even the pious. But when accusations began to touch the highest levels of society, doubt became impossible to ignore. The governor's intervention. The turning point came when Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, was named in an accusation. For months, Phipps had allowed the court of Oyer and Terminer to run unchecked. His attention focused on the colony's wars on the frontier. But now the hysteria had touched his own household. If the devil's net could ensnare the governor's wife, then no one was safe. In October, Phipps dissolved the court entirely. In its place, he established a new tribunal, the Superior Court of Judicature, which rejected spectral evidence. Without the visions of the afflicted, the machinery of accusation sputtered and died. Many of the jailed were released. Trials dwindled. The fever began to break. The ministers spoke out. The colony's leading ministers had also begun to reconsider. Cotton Mather, who had first urged caution but supported the trials, now softened his stance. His father, Increase Mather, spoke more boldly. It were better that 10 suspected witches escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This statement, radical in its time, cut to the heart of the crisis. Fear had blinded the colony to justice, and now the ministers themselves admitted that the court had overreached. The aftermath for the accused. But for many, the reversal came too late. 20 people had already been executed. At least 5 more had died in jail, their bodies wasting away in chains. Scores of families were left broken, their reputations ruined, their properties seized. Even those released carried the invisible scars of suspicion, shunned by neighbors who once called them friends. Children of the accused grew up, branded by their parents' fate. Widows and widowers struggled to reclaim land stripped from them. Some spent years petitioning the government for compensation. A handful eventually received modest restitution, but no payment could buy back a life lost to the gallows. A colony haunted. The people of Massachusetts carried the weight of Salem's tragedy for decades. In 1697, a day of fasting and repentance was declared, a public attempt to cleanse the stain of the trials. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood before his congregation and confessed his guilt, begging for God's forgiveness. Not all judges did the same. The village of Salem itself changed. Over time, Salem Village became the town of Danvers, its name altered as if to bury its past. But the shadow of 1692 never faded. The word Salem would forever be linked with hysteria, injustice,
and the terrifying power of fear.
A lesson etched in history. The Salem Witch Trials remind us of what happens when fear triumphs over reason, when suspicion replaces evidence, and when those in power feed panic instead of calming it. It was not witches that destroyed Salem. It was hysteria, division, and the human hunger for scapegoats. And though centuries have passed, the lesson endures. Mass panic can turn even the most devout community into an engine of destruction. The Salem Witch Trials ended more than 300 years ago, yet their shadow still lingers. They remind us that fear can spread faster than fire, and suspicion can kill more swiftly than the sword. It wasn't demons or spells that destroyed Salem. It was people, ordinary neighbors blinded by hysteria, pressured by power, and convinced that safety could be bought with another person's life. It is easy to look back and think, we would never fall for that. But history whispers otherwise. Every age has its own witch hunts. And the true lesson of Salem is this: whenever fear overrides reason, whenever voices of doubt are silenced, and whenever society chooses blame over understanding, we risk walking the same dark path. If you've stayed with me through this story, you now know the tragedy of Salem wasn't just the lives lost. It was the truth buried under lies, the justice warped by fear, and the community torn apart forever. But Salem is just one story in the endless tapestry of history's secrets. And if you want to uncover more stories of power, ambition, betrayal, and survival, then you're in the right place. Subscribe now to Secrets of History for more cinematic journeys into the past, where every chapter reveals not just what happened, but why it matters today. And if you're ready to keep exploring right now, don't miss my video on the untold story of the Mongol Empire's rise. You'll find it on the end screen, just one click away. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Because history doesn't sleep, it waits.